dedicated slots for special and concluding remarks. Each will take 10 minutes. This will allow us to wrap up our session effectively. We also have dedicated 15 minutes for a question and answer session before we conclude today's panel. The session will be live on our social media sites. To initiate today's discussion, I'm honored to invite Ms. Mehnaz Akbar Aziz, CEO Children's Global Network Pakistan, for her welcome remarks. Ms. Mehnaz Akbar Aziz is a member of National Assembly of Pakistan. She is an advocate of community voices and has experience bringing together stakeholders for dialogues towards reforms and holistic approach of education and policy making. She is a former senior member, Education Task Force, Prime Minister of Pakistan, advisor of the World Bank, founding director, Children's Global Network Pakistan. She also had been member board of directors, Zara Sochiye, Geo Television Network, and Punjab Compulsory Education Commission. So, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. A very, very important session indeed, and I'm very pleased. I was reading the bios of the panelists, and they bring a wealth of experience. Pakistan remains one of the 8 countries badly affected by the climate change, and most of the population that is affected is women and children. And the recent floods 2 years ago that we saw, we still have displacements, and it is said that by 2050 we would have displacements of around 2 million climate migrants by floods and cyclones in Pakistan alone. So today I'm pleased to be initiating and chairing a session that will only focus on gender and the impact of climate change on gender, because gender is pivotal to families, to communities, to the countries. So it is the linchpin for anything. It's not like, you are putting women on the side and discussing them, but women are central to the discussion. And how, by focusing on the women, I would be very keen to know your experiences and how we can integrate them, the global experiences into our own, and also create a global alliance on women in calamities, especially climate change. Thank you so much. And Sadia, you can initiate the discussion now.
Thank you so much, Chair, for initiating this and setting the scene of today's panel. Now let us begin with the panel discussion. I would like to introduce Dr. Amira Swaz. She's a researcher and advocate who works at the Social Contract. Dr. Amira has almost 20-year experience working on these issues across academia, the private sector, think tanks, and NGOs, with her most previous roles at Climate Outreach Action Aid and the Grantham Institute of Climate Change at Imperial College. Amira has a PhD on water, climate, and human rights in Pakistan, and is a contributing author to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report on Gender and Climate Security. So, Amira, I'll come with you with the question. Given the global nature of a climate change and its varying impact of different regions, could you provide insight into the overarching trends of challenging related the gender climate issue on a global scale?
Sure, thank you. It's great to be here. As Sadia said, I did my PhD research on the 2010-2011 floods in Pakistan, and a lot of the focus was on the impact on women and girls and minority communities, and how the kind of solutions that were being put forward included them. So it's really great to be back. I think one thing that's really important to say when we look at the global data is that the climate change, the crisis of climate change, has fundamentally been caused in a period in history that was predominantly under male leadership. This is not to say it's all men's fault by any means, but if we look at the data from the IPCC report, which I recently contributed to, it was during the period of colonial expansion that most of the emissions were triggered. And during that period, it was predominantly men who were in leadership positions. But when we look at the actual evidence of the impacts of climate, now, of course, men are affected in many ways by climate impacts. But if we look at, at a ground level, it tends to be the most vulnerable in society or the most excluded in society who experience the worst impacts. And so from that perspective, and across the world in many countries, that is often women and it's often girls, primarily because they don't necessarily have the same decision-making power, or they don't have the same economic power, or they don't have the same mobilities as men in many communities. So if we look at the Women's Empowerment Index, which is a global index, that has found that, to date, women overall are only reaching about 60% of their potential, whether we look at economic factors, social factors, education, and so on. What we also see is, and you'll see this said over and over again, that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, and there's so much evidence around that. I don't want to go into too much detail because I'm sure my colleagues will do so from a grassroots perspective. But if we look at a macro perspective, 93% of the countries that are most affected by climate change are also in debt distress. So every time you have a major climate crisis, a major extreme event, the state has to find funding to come back from it. So if we look at the devastating floods of last year, there were over $30 billion US in damages that Pakistan has had will have to find the resources for. And that's in a context of being in debt distress already. So 38 out of 63 of the most affected countries can't really afford to invest in public services because they have to be paying off their debts. And a lot of research has shown that the first places that the public services get cut is often things like the women's ministry, or it's often things like social protection, which would support the inclusion and safety of women and girls. So it's very much a structural issue which plays out in every single country of the world. This is not a Pakistan problem or a South Asia problem, although there are those issues of structural inequalities here as well. So women are disproportionately affected, and historically men have been predominantly the ones who've made the decisions. So let's think about women's leadership for a moment. If we look at the global negotiations around climate, which happen every year, the Conference of the Parties, it's happening in Dubai, it starts next week. There's been a big gap in women's leadership. Now, that's not to say there aren't fantastic women leaders. There are, including leaders from Pakistan. Sherry Rahman is a great example from last year's COP. But overall, there's been a really slow progress in having parity of women in leadership positions. So there was a big initiative that was set, I think, in 2012, which said we've got to increase the number of women leaders. By 2022, it only increased by like a couple of percent. So we're currently at 38% this year because the UAE government has actually said that they find this to be an important issue, and their lead negotiator is a woman, Hannah Al-Hashimi, her name is. But overall, there are some delegations that have as low as 10% women in those positions. So that's not just the case at COPs, that's also the case at ministerial levels across the world. And the thing is, and this has been proven in a lot of research, that it's very hard for men to understand the lived experience of women, just as it's very hard for a person who's not from a minority community or who doesn't live with a disability to understand how those inclusions and exclusions play out. So even if somebody is really well-meaning and they want the best for gender equality, or they want the best for equality and other factors, without the lived experience, we can have blind spots. That's why we need women in these positions. That's why we need people from minority communities and people living with disabilities and people from the working classes to be having a say in the solutions. But we're just not seeing that happen at the scale that we need in the decisions. And so what we're finding is that some of the solutions that are being put forward and the ones that have huge amounts of investment are also creating unintended exclusions of those women and girls who could be coming up with solutions and driving forward more gender equal solutions. We also know from the global evidence that when you have gender parity in decision making on climate change, you have better outcomes. So there's tons of evidence, and I can talk you through or send emails and list it off, but there's tons of evidence basically at the global level which finds that whether it's at a policy level, you have better policies overall or more sustainable climate and environment policies when you have more women leaders, not more than women than men, but gender parity. There were some studies which were on, looked at things like resilience and adaptation. So for example, there were studies across South Asia, in Nepal and India, that found that on forest management committees, when you had women, you had increased forest cover, you had more resilience. There's a lot of research on food security. So when you have women in decision-making roles, you have more nutritious and diverse crops, which has benefits for resilience and biodiversity, which is very important for our sustainability, food security, and resilience against climate impacts. So we have this sort of vicious cycle that we need to cut through when it comes to the impacts of climate, the decisions over climate, and we need to start breaking that down by having more gender-just solutions. There are some also long-term negative impacts that I've seen in research I've done over the years, including in Pakistan, of not doing this. So for example, I worked on a project for 3 years, which was called Gender and Violence in Urban Pakistan. And we looked at 16 neighborhoods across Karachi and Islamabad and Rawalpindi over 3 years. And we let the communities of over 2,500 people tell us what they thought the issues were in their lives that were driving violence, and environment and climate change was raised on a number of occasions. And what we learned there is that if the higher the vulnerability to climate impacts, the higher the experience of violence was coming out in those communities. And there were some really interesting linkages that emerged there. So for example, during monsoon flooding it was around September time in Islamabad and Rawalpindi, households would experience greater gender-based violence, and there would be more communal violence because the household became very insecure due to the impacts of floods. And sorry, that is a little bit distracting. Thank you. When the floods were so intense, men had to stay home from their daily wage jobs, and this created stress and insecurity economically, which led to conflict within the household. So there are lots of structural issues which happen as a result of climate impacts, and with more women in leadership, hopefully we can come up with solutions that are sort of sustainable and building resilience. And Pakistan has been talking about gender and gender equality in the context of climate for a long time, as has many of its neighbours, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about it. So some of the questions that have emerged for me over the years since working on this is the sort of sustainability of the gender equality policies. There are fantastic women leaders and there is great language around gender equality, but often the programs are not in the long term, they're more in the short term, or they might be in response to a flood. You know, we have a gender program, but it's not in the long term. So one thing that I would really advocate for as a policy solution is there's something called the Gender Action Plan, which is a part of a commitment under the climate negotiations. Every country in the world has to do one, and they can be very meaningful or they can be not meaningful at all, depending on how seriously the nation takes it. And I think Pakistan's in a wonderful position with all the women leaders that it does have to really develop a gender action plan, which is integrated across government, which enables the structural and financial support for longer term, more sustainable approaches to women's leadership and gender equality in the context of climate change. But I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Dr. Amira, for your shedding the light on the global dimension of gender and climate issues and their implication in Pakistan. Moving on to the discussion, our next panelist is Ms. Bharti Chaturvedi. She has joined us online. She is the founder and director of Chintan Environmental Research and Action Group in India. She is a vocal advocate for inclusive and sustainable approaches to waste management, air pollution, and climate change. She serves in various government committees for policy making. She holds a degree in international public policy from the School of Advanced International Studies and Johns Hopkins University, and is a recipient of a 2009 Johns Hopkins Alumni Knowledge for the World Award. Additionally, she has been honored with the Lead Fellowship and is fellow at the Synergist Institute in New York, USA. So over to you, Ms. Bharti.
Well, thank you so much. What a pleasure to be amongst allies. It's a complete honor to be able to be part of a panel that talks about climate change and focuses on gender and intersectionality, because this is exactly at the heart of the work that Chintan does. I'm going to use a PowerPoint, and please tell me 2 minutes before I'm about to overshoot my time. It's 1:30. So what I thought was our theme for the 26th conference is light at the end of the tunnel. So I thought I'd talk about a couple of big arching ideas and some of our perspectives at Chintan, and then give 3 happy stories, because that should be the light at the end of the presentation at the very least. Chintan, our work on climate change has really been around looking at solutions which are technical, looking at leadership, developing leadership, and also finding other forms of support, whether it's livelihoods or whether it's helping girls and youth to support women in the community. Obviously, I'm going to go through all of that. We can go to the next slide. I have a colleague. So I love this quote that a colleague of mine shared with me, and I want to share it with you. And that is that there's no such single issue struggle, because we don't live a single issue life. And the reason, and this is our Lord, who's an American writer, an intersectional feminist. And I think that's true for women all over the world, but it's particularly true for us in South Asia, because in our worlds, and particularly marginal women, not only are women expected to be complete and full-time caregivers and cooks and run the house, but they also are often engaged in informal employment, which doesn't necessarily give them the kind of security, social security, and livelihood stability that they might need, far from even fair wages. So next slide, please. So I thought I'd briefly talk about, intersectionality and why it's a necessary approach for climate resilience. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is that in South Asia, we are so vulnerable to so many forms of, so many impacts of climate change. But in many ways, we've been left, as the previous speaker said, to our own devices, to our own resources and our own innovation. And we're not really seeing the kind of support we expected from people who actually have precipitated this crisis, whose lifestyles and emissions over the last 2 millennia have precipitated this. And instead, we are taking in the brunt of a completely different population sets, consumption and emissions. So there is really, if we don't talk of intersectionality, we can't really talk of justice. And for us in our part of the world, climate justice is really the core of it. So I don't have to tell you how the term came around, but I think what's really important, and we need to constantly belabor this in our conversations, locally, nationally, and globally, most importantly, about how discrimination and disadvantage is really influenced by the intersection of identities that define a person. So when you have a flood or you have a heat wave, which we experience in India every year, in fact, a poor person, a marginal woman experiences it quite differently. And therefore, an intersectional approach has to put the most marginalized person, which is essentially women who are marginalized, at the center of policy making, because otherwise, how are they going to even exercise their fundamental rights to liberty and life? Next, please. And when we talk about it, next, please. When we talk about it, I thought we'd just quickly take a look at how the UNFCCC recognizes women-led climate resilience, which, by the way, is completely different from how men think of climate resilience. And you see that, we see that as an organization that is a do tank, which is kind of like doing on the ground, but also being a think tank. And women's participation in decision-making processes are very fundamental, and equal control over factors of production is also very important. And I'll give you a really simple example. When we're talking about livelihood schemes that are being rolled out to women necessarily require flexibility because of their multiple roles, but very few of these think out flexibility. So very few livelihoods are available where you can come in and go back, and which are near the house, and which can be extremely decentralized. And if you look at this little chart at the bottom, and this is again not something that is going to, that is not in, it's not in any priority order or in a flow, but it really talks about how this thinking positions women as change makers and acknowledges them as change makers in their local communities, people who bear knowledge. And we're talking often about indigenous knowledge, women who live in forests, are Adivasi women in India. And these are really communities and women who bear knowledge and are able to take informed action. But it also, putting women at the center and intersectionality will help marginal women take local daily action to minimize the impact of climate change, both in their lives and, as I've written, citywide, but it could be really locality-wide. Next, please. And of course, that enables widespread change. We're looking at, I am actually going to skip this slide more or less because of the previous speakers. So next, please, where we're just talking about how this happens. I'll share some data from Chintan, and we look at how continuously disadvantaged women stay. We found that 73% of the women in slums, the most marginal populations that we surveyed in the National Capital Region, had never attended school, so they're illiterate. 77% of the married women viewed husbands as decision makers rather than themselves, so they're already setting themselves out of empowerment, out of the voice. 94% were the primary caregivers, and 75% of them believed that men needed way more nutrition than themselves. We can go to the next slide, please. And so because of this, you can see how this climate change actually interplays with the cycle of poverty and marginalization. Next, please. So I'm now going to, next, please. I'm going to very briefly share how Chintan has been looking at this in a 360-degree way. None of these ideas really, they're not in any hierarchical order because many of them take place according to, many of them run in parallel. They are very, very local, but first of all, our work has shown us that we have to build technical knowledge. And so we've actually invested in helping women understand climate change, both through the heat waves lens and the flood lens, as well as through the fact that housing lens, health lens. And that really, and when we look at that, we also help them understand how certain livelihoods will have diminishing returns, which brings me to the second point of improved livelihoods. And when I talk improved, I specifically talk about a very holistic livelihood, which means access to social security. We have now everyone can have a bank account, but the challenge is how does everyone use a bank account? So not only do you need social security, which helps you to put your earnings into a more secure way rather than keeping them in your slum, which could catch fire, the increasing fires, but also look at livelihoods which may not see the same dips when you have extreme heat, livelihoods which you can undertake in safer spaces. Sometimes in a heat wave where it's 48 or so outside, it could be as much as 55, 56 degrees inside a juggi, a slum, a shanty dwelling. And there's no way, that people can expect a reasonable health or productivity or even avoid sickness. So you obviously want to look at creating safer housing, safer workspace, and improve that. And of course, I don't want to underestimate leadership, and my future slides will demonstrate that. And we believe all of these, only if you do all of these can you actually build a foundational for women-led resilience. Any of these missing and you're on shaky ground. Next, please. I think we have 4 more minutes. Next, please. So I thought we'd talk about Jharna, who's a really, really good, who's basically a green entrepreneur. And she's been collecting plastics. There's been a whole conversation in the last few years about ocean plastics and the need to treat them very differently. And at the cellular level, Jharna has been collecting plastic and selling it for recycling. But just look at the graph. Look at her income and the average picker's income, and you can see that she's earning almost, you would say, almost 3 times more than the average woman. And what caused that? 3 to 4 times more. And one of them, the big one, was flexible working hours. A lot of women are unable to be entrepreneurs or take better paying livelihoods because they just have to be there non-stop. And the reason she could do flexible working hours was because she was an entrepreneur and her work site was near her home. So she could go home and feed her children lunch and come back. The second really important, and we've seen that when women get both sheltered space for work, which is safe space that they can control, lock, keep assets in, and control those assets, then actually the income dramatically increases. It's a research we did along with Circulate Capital, and the report is called Santulan. The other thing was access to markets. And very often women are unable to have the same bargaining power, and they're not able to get the same access to markets. And we found that when we trained women both in numeracy, very basic numeracy, and very basic entrepreneurship, we got this kind of leadership. Next, please. I'm going to show you one more slide because I know I don't want to run out of time before I show you this beautiful, beautiful slide where we looked at building nutritional resilience. Because as we know, nutrition is very compromised for marginalized women, but even so during climate change. And we worked with 5,000 women and in cities, in slums, and helped them run urban farms, which has always been seen as a prerogative of the middle class or the elite. And what we really found was that women were not eating any green vegetables at the beginning. And at the end, they were actually cooking and eating and feeding girls green vegetables. And why this matters is that many of them grew surpluses and were able to generate their own income sitting at home without very high levels of either literacy or, for that matter, having to go anywhere. I think I'll end on the final one. Next, please. This is really small. We had a terrible flood in Delhi earlier this year, and a lot of the women we work with have gone through leadership, and we have a core and a peripheral group of leaders. And during this flood, it was very hard to understand who wanted what because every area was impacted differently. And the women took upon themselves to identify who needed, what they needed, who was most needed, how many babies there were, find the data, communicate with us, and distribute it. And why I really talk about it is, and then they went to the state and identified the most vulnerable hotspots in really large slums and successfully managed to clean specific kinds of drainage based on their training and prevented huge amounts of post-flood waterborne diseases. And there were specific differences between where these women were and where they were not. So next slide, please. So I'm going to end, and that was my light at the end of the tunnel, talking about how important a holistic approach is and how we need to also do building blocks, but then take these lessons to the policy level to be able to design everything in a way that is both intersectional and has multiple lenses through which we build resilience rather than mere adaptation or mere training or mere livelihoods. We need all of these put together. Thank you so much.
implementing the Paris Agreement. And then we have the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So that's the key framework for DRR, which is clearly related to climate. And then a general recommendation number 37 of CEDAW, which focuses on climate change. That's an important piece as well. And of course, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. So just to state that these are some very important global normative frameworks, and also that actually a lot of the recommendations and the solutions that we are looking for, I think in general terms, we can actually find, several ideas and, several ways already within these frameworks. However, I think the issue is how do we actually adapt them to the country context and how we can actually operationalize them, right? Because of course we can have very nice sounding plans, but operationalizing them is really then the next important step. Oh, it's not moving. Okay, so just as an overview of some of the disaster impacts in Asia and the Pacific. So we saw in 2022 that more than 7,500 people died from disasters, and more than 64 million people in the entire Asia and the Pacific were impacted. And the economic loss is more than 57.3 billion. So that's actually a lot of money. And we see actually that South Asia, or rather South and Southwest Asia, is actually the most impacted. So if we can see from the slide, this is just the number of fatalities, but we can see that really South and Southwest Asia is really overrepresented here. And we see that most of the deaths actually come from floods in India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Okay, so now I'm coming to a series of themes on gender and climate change. So the first one, and I think already fellow panelists have mentioned it, that would be in terms of, the care burdens that women face. And these care burdens are extremely disproportionate to that shouldered by men in South Asia. So if we can look at the slide here. So in this case, blue actually stands for women, and red actually stands for men. So you can see that, how much time does a woman spend, or rather how many women, the proportion of persons in charge of fetching water, we see that a lot more women are in charge of fetching water as compared to men. And we can see it being very, very different in the Pacific Islands, actually, where we see that a lot of more men are involved in, fetching water. And it's interesting because if we look at the time required, then men actually require less time to fetch water. So if there is a proper distribution of labor, then it is actually more efficient for men to do so. But for cultural and other reasons, we do see that women's, basically the fetching of water is just a very snapshot representation of unpaid care burdens. But basically, it shows that a lot more women spend a lot more time than men, and a lot more women than men work on unpaid care. Okay, so how does unpaid care burdens actually, what is the relationship between unpaid care burdens and climate change? Because what happens when during climate change is it makes the situation more severe, and so more work is involved in caring for people, for plants, for animals, for the places as well. At the same time, because of climate change during disasters, for example, it could be that there are no public services, then the women have to also shoulder on additional unpaid care burdens. The other thing to note is that because women need to play their role as caregivers, this also affects their mobility during disasters and the capacity to recover. Okay, so then the next one we would like to talk about is the impact on climate change on agriculture, and how this impact on agricultural yields actually link with the well-being of women. So I only have the statistics now on how lands have become arid, but there have been many other studies that talk about the impact of women's child marriage, adolescent births, intimate partner violence, as well as limited access to water and clean fuels. And women are affected by this when there are lower agricultural yields. So when climate change actually, makes poorer agricultural use, then women actually suffer a lot more. So we can see here from this aridity index. So the more arid the region, and of course in red, that's South Asia. So we have Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. The more arid the area, actually, the more percentage of women married before age 18. We see that there's a huge gap in Nepal and also in Bangladesh between the arid and non-arid areas. Okay, then the next one is the feminization of agriculture. So if we see the bar chart over here, we see that in South and Southwest Asia, there is a lot more women in agriculture proportionately than men. This is actually, if we look at the other parts of Asia and the Pacific, the difference is not so pronounced, but in South and Southwest Asia, it is an extremely pronounced difference. And this actually has a huge impact because more women are involved in agriculture, and when climate change affects agriculture, then it's a number game, right? So then more women are naturally affected. But beyond that, there are specific gender-related challenges for women when they work in agriculture. So for example, women has limited contacts and networks, so they actually have difficulties then in assessing, like buying or renting agricultural tools and inputs. And when they engage with men, there could be harassment as well by their community, because of the view that, how come you're engaging with other men? So we see that this comes from a study on Bihar, India, as well as the northern parts of Pakistan. And because of climate change, there's more and more migration. And when there's more migration, we see that migration is primarily male. And when the men leave the fields, then the women have more burden to go into agriculture to support their families. So we see some examples. For example, in Nepal, in the Dhanusha district, because of male migration, there are 23% of women-headed households. And of these, there are 83% are actually for small farm cultivators. And another point to note is that usually the male migrants do not really send the money back home. So then the females are left, to really support the family. Okay, the next thing is on asset ownership. So we see that actually asset ownership among women as compared to men is proportionately a lot lower. And apart from Bhutan, actually, most of the sub-regions, there is actually discriminatory policies as well that undermine women's property ownership. So we can look at this figure over here again, the graph, and you can look at the asset ownership in South and Southwest Asia versus the other parts of Asia and the Pacific. I draw your attention to Pakistan, the number of women or the percentage of women, who owns agricultural land versus the percentage of men. That's an extremely large gap over there. Okay, and then because of social norms, women are also disadvantaged when disaster strikes. So, for example, some families may be against taking female members to shelters without male presence because they are afraid that their female family members may be affected, and that then endangers the safety of the females. At the same time, it is true that when women go to shelters, they are at actually heightened risk of be it sexual abuse or just very bad conditions as well. And we do see as well, there was a figure, Nepal witnessed an increase in trafficking after the 2015 earthquake. Okay, I wanted to bring everyone's attention to women with disabilities because they actually suffer from the double advantages of being disabled and also being a woman. And based on some very quick calculations, there's actually more than 165 women with disabilities in South and Southwest Asia. So you imagine how many women are actually being disadvantaged. So they are disproportionately affected by the immediate and long-term effects of disasters in terms of mortality rate, in terms of experiencing violence. And apart from the direct and indirect impact of disasters, the slow onset of climate change might also lead them to lose employment, and they might have more difficulties in gaining employment because they might only be able to assess specific types of employment. Okay, so just some very, very general recommendations that I think all of us understand. No? There's a need to mainstream gender throughout the policy cycle. And for climate change, it is very important to have vertical and horizontal coordination, because there's not just one ministry who's involved in climate change. There are many different ministries, so there has to be good coordination. Whole of society approaches, getting the women organizations involved, getting other NGOs and CSOs involved. One thing to actually encourage women as contributors for climate action is actually to promote opportunities for women in the green economy. We saw an example just now from the panelists online on, in the waste management sector. There are also opportunities in renewable energy, in sustainable agriculture. And finally, to really protect the women through gender responsive and disability inclusive social protection that deals with climate change. Okay, so that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Our next panelist is Dr. Bishnu Raj Apreti. Dr. Bishnu Raj is currently serving as Research Director at the Nepal Center for Contemporary Research with 40 years of experience in development-oriented research in public policy. He was previously the Executive Chairman of the Policy Research Institute, a think tank affiliated with the government of Nepal. So, sir, you are requested. Yes.
Not working? It's okay? And thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the chance. I am so privileged or lucky speaker that I am here in a panel where chair, facilitator, moderator, speakers, all are female, and I am only representing the male group. That also shows how important it is to deal on that issue. I will be a little bit positioning myself into more methodological, conceptual part of dealing with the issue, not looking to what effects women have, because it has been proven already, and all the speakers have shown that. Therefore, I will quickly put one argument proposition saying that if we want to really address the disproportional effect to women, children, and other disabled group of people or other weaker section of society, we have to have the different type of the broader the thinking, different type of the learning, and different type of the action orientation. By using intersectionality is one of the effective methods to deal on, but there are also other many methods which we'll be able to address. So it's also a bit from more the affected side, we have to have more mechanism, etc. So with that proposition, I will present my whole idea here in 10-12 minutes. Of course, we are very clear from so many evidences that South Asia is one of the highest hit from the climate-related insecurity, risk, injustice, all that. And the second proposition is that we have to have collective understanding, more concerted action to deal on that. And how we can deal that, we have to have the different understanding, different conceptual framework, and then only we can do. Very nicely, Bharati and Stephanie and others shows that There are so many interesting innovations, interesting results at the local level, but how to bring them into broader level. So for that also we need to have the mechanism, the networks, the provisions that ensures our concern to address and to reach to the level where we want to reach. So basically with that, I am highlighting that there is a comprehensive collective need, and that need at this point to address that challenges is more system thinking. What does this mean? Looking to integrated way, because women's marginalizations, women's impact of climate insecurity to women is not only because of one factor: poverty, inequality, injustice, discrimination, lack of access to the resources, etc., etc. And therefore, we have to look to all these factors in a more holistic way from the system thinking. Then for that, what we need, we have to learn from themselves. We have to learn from the community. So far, I am trained as a researcher, academics, intellectual, but that is that part that is required. But it is not enough. If we really want to address the negative impact, we have to listen them. We have to learn from the community. We have to learn from their priority and concern, and then based on we have to develop, and that is what we call it as a social learning. Learning from the society, learning from the community, learning from the affected people, bringing the knowledge of this scientific community and embedding them into the social knowledge, into the collective action. So the third one is that we have to have the collective response for this type of the situation, ranging from policymaker, politician, researcher, academic, civil society, NGO, donors, whoever they are, because it is not only a concern and problem of the women. It is a concern and problem of the society. If women, children, elderly are not able to cope with that situation, where is family, where is society, and where will they exist? So whatever powerful USA is or UK is or whoever it is, at the end it is a collective responsibility to address, and therefore this conceptual schema of looking from the system thinking and learning from the society and community and coming together and addressing. So these climate negotiations, these all are, you see. Why we have to do that? It is obvious. Why they are not ready? Why there is every step we have to make this argument and that argument to get the climate finance in the right track, to the right people, in the right time, in the right place. Because there is lack of collective understanding of the complexity of the problem. Looking to the sectoral way, looking to only economic prosperity will not lead. It seems like we are more talking about general advocacy term, but it is not. Because of the effect in the ice melting in Himalaya will entirely affect to the southern plains of India and Bangladesh. If there is something here in the other side of the planet, it will affect to the other side. So in that, why we are not really able to look it from the broader system thinking and system perspective. So there, system thinking, we have to have the long-term vision. We have to have more collective type of the understanding. Problems should be understood in the similar way. So nice type of the success stories Bharati brought earlier, how these women are doing. But is it laudable enough to reach to the concerned people? It's not, and therefore for that we have to have more broader, holistic, long-term path. It will lead to the social learning, and it has to inform by the intersectional analysis, public policy dialogue, the debate, the nexus approach, linking one another, and community engagement. If we look from that perspective, it will help really to the concerted action. What does concerted actions means? people are coming together, thinking together, looking the solution together, whether it is adaptive, we have to make the adaptive decision, adaptive options and strategy, not only at the community level, it has to go to the national level, to the regional level, because I am talking here at the South Asia, therefore up to the regional level. It's also equally applied to the global level. And then it has to be tackled through certain mechanisms. In my belief, I am working in South Asia for 25, 30 years as a researcher in different countries and teaching in the universities. And my single most realization is that we have to have some sort of the regional mechanism, national mechanism that are common for all of us. So these are strong networks. There should be a system. For example, SDPI, SDC is one of the platform, but we need hundreds of them, hundreds of this type of the more systematic, institutionalized mechanism where we can bring the lessons, where we can bring the challenges and debate and discuss, and that is essential. And the affected part has to develop that. Means we South Asian have to develop that mechanism. If the European will come and say we will give the funding and we establish it, it will not work. We have to have, now we have other technological advantages like the online platform, etc. Then we have to have more systematic research on this issue at the university level, research organizations level, and also societal level, because research, scientific research is one thing, but the realization of the people and their way of the solution is quite important. Another thing which we have to document, analyze and present it, that is another part. And also there is based on this, we have to have the strong network, power network. Later we will also hear from other colleagues to influence the policy making process, because our policy are more sectoral, more type of top down, not all, but still it's more top down, sectoral, and it is not, these policies are not able to give the space for system type of the thinking and collective learning. It's a sector, ministry, department, and the line there, and they do their work. So in that way, it will not work. And similarly, the regulatory framework should be more supportive, facilitative, not restrictive. For example, if one woman has to access to the loan, she has to go for so many complicated procedure, and at the end, frustration and it's not working. Therefore, legal provisions, legal law, regulation, etc., must be facilitative, and also the institutional arrangement, these ministries, these government bodies, these NGO, they are for the help of the people, and therefore they should also be quite flexible to help them. And with that framework, we can do, my assumption is that until and unless we are not really able to establish that type of the mechanism, policy change is slow, the institutional response is also delayed, or the slow, not efficient and effective, changing legal provision is also equally complicated, and therefore we have to engage the politician, political decision maker, the activist, all into this type of the debate. That is one. The other one, this gender inequality is not a concern of female. It's not a concern of women or children or children. It's a national concern, because it's affecting whole policy, whole population of the country, and at the end, the future of the country, and therefore this type of the understanding is not yet reached to the policy level, political level, and we have to do that. There are so many points I was raising, but I am not going to deal considering the time frame, etc. At the end, I conclude that the existing socially, economically marginalized group are disproportionately affected, and it will grow more based on the evidences we hear, and therefore we have to have the clear response mechanism For addressing this challenge, we have to develop the system thinking, looking from the system perspective, broader system perspective, and also learning from the community and making the collective action. And for that, we need some sort of policy changes, legal changes, and also institutional flexibility and capable human resources. For example, I have to be clear first, and then I can advocate. If the person who are not able to clear themselves how we are going to address that, their advocacy will not work. So only we have to this, we have to this will not work. We have to this because of this, with the clear options we have to able to give, and for that, this intersectional analysis is one method. There are so many other gender analysis method, poverty analysis method. It's a technical is not the issue. It's the outcome is the issue. And therefore we have to work collectively at South Asia level. We have to establish different type of mechanism and networks that will continuously feed each other, learn from each other, and advocate for each other. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Dr. Vishnu. Our next presenter is Ms. Rushati Das. She's a program coordinator in the Climate Action Network South Asia, Kansa, where she leads the loss and damages program across 6 South Asian countries, focusing on the interconnection between climate change and human mobility. She has expertise in adoption and in the incorporation of gender perspective within the climate change initiative.
Thank you, Sadia, and good afternoon, everyone, and my fellow panelists. So, can I, before I start with my gender and climate change presentation, but we have heard a lot from our panelists about how these women and children are more affected in South Asian countries because of climate change. And also because of climate crisis, we heard a lot of examples and data from Amira and Ms. Chu and our chair also. So I'm not going to that extent, but we know that this is mainly because of our gender. I mean, women and children are having those social structural barriers, and also because of lack of access of finance and legal rights, and they can't make decision and we have seen that in most of the South Asian countries, and in 6 South Asian countries, I guess. And that led to threats for livelihood, health, and even their protection and safety. We know due to migration, many of the women and children have least protection when they migrate, and also when the men of the family migrates, the women are left behind, and they are highly vulnerable in those situations. So, so the term we use this here as that gender. I mean, in climate crisis, we can't say that it is a gender neutral climate crisis, because women are more affected than men. Going to my next slide, and here I can give you an example that Kansa and we, along with Save the Children, went for an assessment of national policies. Last year it happened, and it was mainly in 3 countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And there we found, we didn't run it an extensive, highly policy, but we have seen it overall in an overall way. But we found that mainly in 3 countries, if I see the key findings here, so mainly in 3 countries, after reviewing the policies, Nepal do have largely gender responsive policies. I mean, the women and children are there in their policies, but what we didn't found that they don't have budget allocation in those policies. So that is a missing part in those policies of Nepal. And when we see in Bangladesh one also, there also we found that Bangladesh shows a good response on women and gender, especially along with the children also. But their policy also have a lack of budget allocation. And whereas in Sri Lankan policy, we didn't find any mention of specific gender or women. So neither there is any mention of budget allocations or anything on the policy side. So this is what we found in 3 countries of South Asia, but we can understand from our other panelists' remarks that these policies are, other countries' policies are having same issues, that women and children are less there in specification of women and children are less there in the policies along with the budget areas. So if you see the climate finance, which is a big topic. I'm not going over there in the big topic, and we know that how this amount of money should come from that place, and I'm not going there, but the action plans of climate finance and or the action plans that each of the countries have on their own in the national plans and indicators, we don't see any gender specific action plans. We see a lot of recommendations over there, but we don't find any gender specific recommendations or any gender specific climate finance indicators in those action plans. So moving on, I will not take much of my time, our time. So I will just go for 2 recommendations from my side. That firstly, we need a gender transformative program, because we know from since past women are more women include themselves more of the household works, or in villages we see them as accessing the water, natural resources like firewoods, and they have to do the major household works. So so they are good manager of natural resources. So now what we need is the preparedness and make them more engaged, considering them more engaged in climate agenda, and this will also lesser the carbon footprint. And secondly, I will recommend it as a removal of social structural barriers, so that women can access climate finance and include them in related areas. And also this need to be done from all the 3, from all sides, like in local policies, in national policies, and also in regional policies. Because unless and until it is come in the regional and South Asian policies, none of the country will get developed properly. And it is not a, one country is having gender policies, others are not having it, then there is no, that will be like pulling down the other countries in South Asia. So for better upliftment, we need all the countries to have gender policies in their national policies as well. So so that is my, so this is my last point, and sorry, I forgot to change my slide also. So that is my last point. So we need a subnational local level policies, inclusive policy for gender responsive, and that will require for essential, for resilient, and suitable for inclusive growth. And there I stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bharti. Now I would like to request Ms. Aisha Khan for her special remarks. Ms. Aisha Khan, with over 22 years of experience in development work, leads the Mountain and Glacier Protection Organization and the Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change. Ms. Khan is a recognized figure on several board of directors, offering expert advice on climate change adaptation and mitigation. She currently conducts a working group on climate security at the Strategic Policy Planning Cell of the National Security Division, and is a part of External Advisory Council for the World Bank South Asia Regional Climate Change Action Plan. Additionally, Ms. Aisha Khan serves as a policy advisor and a fellow of International Center for Intersectional Mountain Development, and as a member of Pakistan Climate Change Council. She also has been honored with the Bright Award for Environmental Sustainability from Stanford University in 2019 and the National Order of Merit by the government of France in 2021 and the Pakistan Civic Award Tamgha Imtiaz in 2023. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you, STPI, for organizing this very important panel discussion. And it's a great honor indeed for me to be part of this broader representative panel discussion. I think when we look at the global normative framework on gender equality, it is articulated very well in SDG 5, which has 9 targets and 14 indicators. So we're going to look at it now today through the lens of South Asia on how climate change impacts gender. So the first thing I think we need to do is to admit that South Asia is still predominantly a patriarchal society. There has been some improvement over the years, especially among the upward mobility middle class in making some changes in the gender parity indexes. But in rural communities where I spend a lot of my time and I work, I find that the mindsets are still mired in concepts that don't allow women equal space or exposure to break the barriers of entrenched societal norms and cultural traditions that hold them back. And here I think I'm going to build a little bit more on what Dr. Uprati said, because essentially this is all about mindsets and about social norms and social concepts. So unless we address the core issue as the problem, it will be very difficult to move forward and try and address all the other areas in which we think that changes should take place. In some parts of South Asia, the ratio of female employment is higher, creating a direct intersectionality between gender, climate, and resilience. In countries where there is discrimination at the policy level, we see that women are vulnerable. And in countries where we see that women have been empowered, we see that women are more resilient. So in this aspect, as I said, since I work with mountain communities, I'm going to relate climate change with direct examples, not just broadly speaking in food, water, agriculture, energy, but directly to the communities as I witnessed firsthand in my 20 years of experience of working closely with mountain communities. And when I say closely, it means that I go and live for weeks with them in their community, with them, experiencing firsthand the problems, the challenges, the hardships they face, and in mobilizing them to become part of decision-making within conservative societal setups. So when we look at the agriculture sector, I see most of the time that it's women who are working as labor on the fields, whether it is during harvesting time or during plantation. But I rarely see that their efforts are monetized, which means that the labor is used, but there's no income that is generated for them. When I see the responsibility for water collection, and I'm glad you shared that slide to show that men actually are capable of collecting water, but in our parts of the world, this is exclusively the responsibility of women. You see women making long hauls, but you also see girl child's future being compromised because they are pulled out of school and their attendance falls and their grades fall because they are used for water-bearing responsibilities. And we see directly when we provide access to safe water or access to irrigation water in these communities, that the scorecard for the girl child attendance and grade starts to improve. And that is also perhaps one reason where you see that there is high rate of enrollment in the primary education in Pakistan, and a drastic drop when it goes to secondary education or middle education, because that's where they start using the girl child for informal labor, especially related to domestic chores. For energy, I'll go no beyond cooking stoves that women have to use in rural areas, because the fumes that they absorb as a result of the firewood or the fossil fuels that they use has a direct impact on their health. In disasters, in loss and damage situations, the outmigration exposes them to risks. And in health, since their health is neglected to begin with, they suffer even more and they're the last recipients of health. When rural health structures or basic health units get damaged, it's not women who are able to travel independently to tertiary healthcare centers to get the kind of treatment they need. And because women have to go through the issues of reproductive health also, the frequent pregnancies that they have to bear and the highest rate of fertility perhaps of women that we find in South Asia is amongst women in Pakistan, adds to that problem. We do have the National Climate Change Policy, we have the Adaptation Policy, we have the Gender Action Plan. But I think if you look at a comparison between the developed and developing countries, one of the things that you will find is that all developed countries show that women are empowered over there, and all developing countries show that women are not empowered over there. And that is your biggest comparison to relate vulnerability with resilience, to say that if you leave half of the population of this world behind, there is no way that you can aim towards progress. Let me talk a little bit about inclusion and tokenism, where women are included in decision-making or part of processes in consultation. I find it's largely tokenistic. It is not genuine empowerment. When we talk about community-based disaster risk management, training, workshops, etc., what I have noticed in my own experience working with communities is that women are from day one treated as someone vulnerable who need to be provided support. They're not used as rescue, as relief agents. They are not used to be part of the rehabilitation. They are looked at as someone who needs to be rehabilitated, but they're not made part of the engagement process of how rehabilitation should be done. So in my opinion, I feel that women are not vulnerable, because I have seen some very strong women even in Pakistan, and I mean physically strong, who are able to scale high mountains, which means that women are not born vulnerable, but it is society that makes them vulnerable. And what we lack is actually psychological spaces for women. We talk often about physical spaces, we talk about economic and social spaces, but we don't talk about that psychological space for women, which frees their minds to liberate them and makes them think freely that they are responsible and capable of making life choices. Related to climate change, I'm also going to talk about new risks that are going to come. We are opening up soon in other countries in South Asia to carbon credit markets. I'll just bring your attention to the new scandal that has broken out in Kenya right now related to projects for offsetting carbon. There are reports of harassment, there are reports of exploitation, there are reports of sexual abuse, which have made big investment companies like Netflix and McKinsey and Shell and Microsoft exit from there. So these opening up these market means that we're also opening up, in the name of climate change and making money, new risks and exposures that will threaten women. So I think before we move forward in every development project that we plan, we should try and have a very robust environmental social framework that sensitizes communities on the rights of all people, including women. So taking a human rights and a rights-based approach, which is all inclusive, will go a long way in helping us to strengthen the cause of women and their rights as well. Lastly, since we're talking here at the this convening about the light at the end of the tunnel, I would just like to say that there are three things that are happening right now that give me a little bit of hope. First, it's the rapid urbanization, which we feel is a bad thing because rural landscapes are vanishing and we're going to have 50% urbanized cities in the next 20 or 30 years. But it also means it's opening new exposures to women and new opportunities and employment for them. Secondly, the social media is playing a very important role in giving a voice to women and the ability to say things virtually which they may not have been able to say otherwise. The third is climate change itself. I think the impacts are so widespread and so multidimensional that men are realizing that without empowered women, they will not have the coping capacity to move forward. And I just give you this as an example that I work in mountain communities, and 20 years ago when I first started work there and I said we are going to mobilize communities and institutionalize them, but we will have 40% representation of women. I received a pushback and communities said we are not going to let our women be part of social groups that are part of decision making. And we didn't put up any confrontation with them. We said, all right, you don't have your needs strong enough to make women part of it. We'll just go to your neighboring village. The neighboring village accepted us, and within a year or two, when they saw the transformative changes that took place in that village as a result of the irrigation, the clean drinking water, the flood protection walls, they came back to us. And now, after 20 years, in the northern regions where I work, all the communities know that if we want a project to be implemented in our community, it should be a women's delegation that should go forward with that. So that already means that that space for women has been created. So all these changes are happening faster now. We see more women in public places. We see more demand for equality and a new generation of men who have different perceptions of women. I think that's a very positive development also. So let me just conclude by saying that social changes are always slow. Transformative changes are even slower, but the nature of civilizational shift in gear is such that once it starts happening, it picks up momentum and it builds rapidly. So I see the change around me. I'm hopeful that if we as women empower other women, the transformational change will happen much faster. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Ma'am, thank you so much. Before I request to the chair for the conclusion, if we have any questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much for wonderful presentations and covering the whole aspects of the womanhood, and we are hopeful that as Ms. Aisha Khan has said, that we are hopeful that the changes are going to be made. And regarding the social media, I think that is making the ripples in the water. So I have a small comment on that, in South Asia, that more of the women are involved in the agriculture. And according to the Labor Force Survey, Pakistan, it is like more than 70% are involved in that. And and they are making really changing the scenario, and they are but there are their biological needs. They are being neglected. But there are some work on sporadic work is going on regarding their MHM and their MNCH facilities and all these things, but it is not global, or it is not, every woman is not getting that. During the 15 to 49 years of age, they are having babies and they are just breastfeeding and everything. But there are not many areas where these things are being prioritized. And the other thing is like that these are the reproductive years, young women, and they are they can take care of themselves. But at the same time, the older women, now the life expectancy has increased. The older women are not they are also involved in the agriculture, but they are not being taken care of, and especially their health matters. Like the more prevalent NCDs are in the like hypertension, blood pressure, and all these things. And as the age grows, their bone and dental health is very much neglected in these women. And I think in your scope, these should also be included. And very important is like there is health, like for example, the air pollution, household air pollution. That is, the women are the most exposed to the household air pollution, and their life expectancy is decreasing. And I think that is the area where this is related to the climate change, but it has to be taken care of, and it has to be. And then caregivers are mostly the women are especially in the Southeast Asia, mostly the women are the caregivers of the elderly as well as the children. But their health, their mental health is not explored, and also in and due to the climate change, these women are continued having the anxiety, climate anxiety, and especially the women who are living in these areas which are having recurrent floods. Those are in continuous low-grade anxiety, and then that ends into the depression or bigger consequences. Thank you very much.
So now I would like to request Ms. Mehnaz Akbar Aziz for the concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to congratulate all the panelists for their comments coming from years and years and decades of experiences, research plus, hands-on implementation experiences from various countries. And if you put it all together, then we can come up with a very robust policy and intersectional implementation plan. So some of the things that are, some of the areas that are big takeaway from today's discussion remains to have gender strategy, sectionality, and also to talk about disabilities, and as you talked about mental health resulting in the physical dilapidation, asset ownership, and then I liked the comment from my Nepal's colleague about the gender inequality. The putting it in the corner, not putting it central. It's not a women's issue only, it's a national issue, it's a national concern. And this morning I was on a TV show talking about women's voter registration and low voter turnout, and that's what exactly I was saying, that it's not a women's issue. It's not for us women in parliament to talk about it. It's a national issue, it's a national crisis, and such is the crisis. The climate crisis is not just a gender crisis, it impacts women and children more, and the elderly. But I think that's a very, very important point. I think Aisha, I've known her work for the longest possible time that she's been working. So her points are on that women are not really vulnerable, and that we are realizing in Pakistan that women are not vulnerable. And from the recipients to the policymakers, that is, Pakistan is ahead. We have some great leaders. Aisha is one of those in pushing women from implementation, working with the communities, to bringing them to the policy table. They have to be part of the policy table, and we have to ensure all of this. Even if the panelists came together to work on that, I think that will happen. The fact that social media has a part to play, and climate change has empowered women to be central, for men to recognize them to be central to improving lives in such scenarios. I would like to thank the STPI team, Sadia Sati and all of you who are working here for putting this panel together. It's been a very, very, like an alive and integrated and experience solution-based panel. Thank you very much.
May I request all the panelists to come forward to the photo?
सामने. Yesterday I was speaking at a panel and we stood behind. So all of this, and our bags come in between.